to Shifting the Lens, Empowering Women's History in Academia. My name is Andie Purks, and I'll be the moderator. Today I'm joined by these 4 distinguished panelists from Rutgers University who are going to help bring unique insights into the historical conversations that have long been overlooked in women's history. Thanks everyone for being here, and let's get started. If everybody could introduce themselves.
I'm Rachel Devlin, professor of history at Rutgers, New Brunswick.
I'm Cai Barias. I'm a grad student in the Department of History at UMass Amherst, and I work at the Center for American Women in Politics at Rutgers, New Brunswick.
Hi, I'm Seth Koven. I'm Lessing Professor of History in the History Department here at Rutgers.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chie Ikeya. I'm also in the Department of History, Associate Professor. I teach Asian, modern Asian, colonial, and women and gender history, and I also direct the Institute for Research on Women.
All right, thank you so much. So I'd like to start off by asking whoever would like to begin, how would you define women's history? What is women's history to you?
So this is would seem like a self-evident question, but it's actually quite complex. There's the immediate job of bringing historical actors into the record, and women's agency. And then there's the further attempt to look at gender through a wider lens involving masculinity and femininity. But I would say in terms of bringing women in, that seems like a very easily attainable goal. But there are 2 things about it that make it difficult. The first is the fact that once women are often brought into the light of history, those narratives and that academic work does not gain traction with the larger profession. It may for a moment, it may for a few years, but in general, it's hard to keep them in mind. I often think of a quote by Blanche Wiesen-Cook, who was the biographer of Eleanor Roosevelt. And she said, this is a bit dark, but she said that history tends to bury what it seeks to reject. And that act of rejection appears at this moment to have ended, but in my experience, there's still an active rejection, and so there has to be an ongoing discovery and rediscovery. So we have to be as busy at that as the rest of the profession is at burying certain narratives.
I think maybe we could even still return to women's history begs the question of who or what gets called and named or gets to call oneself a woman. And part of what I think has been thrilling here at Rutgers for me as a person who's taught women something called women's history my whole career is how our students have challenged me to actually go back to that fundamental question of what is the name woman mean, who gets to use that name and under what conditions. And that's led me to have a commitment in my teaching in women's history to acknowledge how in the past people used the word woman or spoke the collective group of people called women, but never myself reinforced the biological necessity of understanding women as people born to a certain sex that's irrevocable. So to put that more simply, in my own lecture classes, the brilliance and presence of students who reject the binary of man, woman as relevant to their own personhood, their presence and their ideas have challenged me to ask a question that at the beginning of my career, it never seemed like I had to ask, which is the name woman, what does it constitute? And what are the ways in which biological sex, which we've done so much to deconstruct as a group of scholars, I'm sure around this table as well, how we have to push back against that and to think through the very nature of what woman and women mean.
I mean, I wholeheartedly agree. And that's where I think as historians we have something to offer is precisely historicizing how that entire link, that presumption about biological sex, right, arises, in history, that is a historical development as opposed to just a naturalized sort of state of affairs, right? So, for me, I think the point that women's history is about questioning received wisdoms about what women are or have been, right? I think that's been really, really sort of the key and why we do women's history.
And who and what might yet become. Because I
Absolutely.
think everyone here will agree that there's a way in which teaching women's history, or what we call women's history, is an opportunity to use the past to think about potential futures not yet realized.
Definitely. Yeah. I wanted to move on to my next question, which is about, so women's history as a field is relatively new. It only really got started around the 1970s. So I wanted to ask you guys, how in your experience has the field evolved over time?
I think that we all have somewhat different answers to that, given the fact that we all do such different histories, right? Even though we all work on women's and gender history. I mean, I think that's the thing about women and women's history is the question of like who are the subjects of women's and or gender history, and what are the projects of women's and gender history. I mean, that is a question that remains pertinent and vexing today, as it was, right, across the long 20th century. So I think we probably have somewhat different answers.
Well, I don't know if it's fair to start with me because I'm still in the generation of coming up with my own ideas of women's history. So as a grad student, the first assignment that I had was to read Joan Scott's On Gender. But then when I turn to look at the books that I'm reading for my fields or the research that I'm engaging with that's contemporary, I feel like the conversation is so far different from what they were first talking about in terms of even bringing women's agency back into the conversation. Now we are seeing historians talk more about rejecting binaries and looking back and finding evidence or understanding how, for example, trans people existed in the archives. And I think that's really interesting. I also find it, as myself, a grad student, thinking about how I'm going to engage with women in gender studies, it's more about policing the behavior. Like when I think about the way that gender is enforced, it's more about policing behaviors and attitudes and things like that, rather than always thinking about the biological sex. But I think it's interesting that you bring it up in this roundtable.
Women's history evolved into a history of sexuality, and other modes of investigation have been brought in, but with women's history being the beginning. So history of sexuality, history of childhood, the history of love, the history of emotions. And these topics were not considered legitimate prior to women's history. So it opened up a large field, and the fluidity of gender and its relationship to biology is an especially urgent question in the world we live in. But I would also go back to the 1970s for a moment to just, with a scholarship that assumed the category of woman, and it was solid, the way it was looked at initially. Bringing in some of these figures is important to do, or to revisit now, because I'm constantly surprised how little students know about basic figures that we would assume they come into the classroom with. To give an example, I'm teaching a graduate seminar on US history, and no one knew who Emma Goldman was. So I feel the need at times to back up and include some biography, actually, and that when I include biography, my undergrads really appreciate it.
My own sense there was a women's history before the 70s, and our own wonderful Board of Governors, Professor Emerita Bonnie Smith, wrote brilliantly about the amateur women historian of the 19th centuries who did so much to shape the making of the discipline of history as a field and were such an important presence. And even in 1943, Nellie Nielsen was the first woman who became the president of the American Historical Association. She was a medieval British historian. So there is a history even before that. But the moment that you're describing in the 70s, I think of women's history as emerging in tandem with a particular activist vision of feminist politics and of what was called the women's movement, that together began to make demands on what might have been powerfully but crudely called patriarchy, and that is the resistance of admission of people other than men to all sorts of forms of knowledge and power. And so in the 70s, there was a keen sense in which to engage in women's history was also to take a political position vis-a-vis the rights of non-male persons to have citizenship, to have a stake in the major issues in society. And that gave the practitioners a keen sense of solidarity, even though it could never erase the different ways in which race, class, gender, and sexuality divided those women, even as they sought forms of unity in the name of what was that political movement called feminism and the women's movement. So that 70s moment really did create incredibly powerful bonds, but it also papered over important differences that subsequent scholars have done so much to illuminate.
No, and I would have to say, as someone who, does not work on U.S. history as such or as, per se, and my specializations in Asia and colonized parts of the world, global South, as it were. It strikes me as a very sort of U.S.-centered periodization, right? Like the 1970s. But also, I think in teaching women's and gender history at Rutgers, it struck me that it really erases and diminishes the history of like state-sponsored, women-centered histories that were written in the sort of moment of colonial, post-colonial independence, right? In many parts of the world. We can take issue with, that it's propaganda or that it's highly sort of, politically motivated and prejudiced forms of scholarship. But for many of these countries, the question of national sort of emancipation could not be sort of divorced from the question of women's emancipation, right? And liberation. And looking back at sort of these, heroic figures, women figures, right, in their countries, and recovering that history as part of recovering the nation and sort of returning it to its former glory, as it were, right? Even if these nations were coming into being for the first time, I think that was really central to the national and government-sponsored projects. And so I think in that sense, there's some sort of revisiting of that, scholarship that we sort of disavowed, actually, right, as belonging legitimately in the history of women, right?
Right.
So, I think it's...
So to give that, to name some specifics, one might think then with Chie that there's a huge recuperation of women actors at the moment of the birth, the early triumphs of Egyptian nationalism with the Egyptian nation as woman and the recuperation and production of narratives around that. And likewise, one can do that globally. So I think that you're absolutely right, that the 70s seems incredibly pivotal from a US point of view and from a Rutgers point of view. In 1973, the first big Berkshire Conference on the History of Women was held here at Douglas. And the volume that emerged was edited by our own Victorian English women's historian, co-edited Mary Hartman. So it feels very compelling, the 70s, but it's so helpful to have others remind us, as Chie has, that there are different chronologies and different histories in which women's roles and histories have served the needs of different groups of people, not just women, in their recuperation.
Definitely. Since you guys were talking about, some of you were talking about the ways in which women's history has been or comes from contentious and kind of controversial points, have you ever experienced resistance to the study of women's history, and what was or would be your response to challenges to women's history?
So I had experience teaching the U.S. lecture, 1865 to the present, and it was my first class that I taught here, and I was determined to bring women's history in. And people come into that class, particularly as a U.S. history class, with all kinds of expectations about what is, what matters, who is a historical actor, presidents' wars, et cetera. And when I brought in some of the social history of women, I had 3 male students get up and leave. And in front of the whole class, it was extremely disruptive. And it was demoralizing as a professor. So I think the ways in which we incorporate women's history, often because women's history is based on social factors that would have to be quantified, that were not quantified. It talks about subjects that are alien to many students as historians, as they become historians themselves. And as women's historians have to be very imaginative about the way they knit together sources and information, and that process is not always evident to undergraduates. So we have to not only bring in what has not been brought in, but ways of doing history that may not seem accessible immediately. So it's sort of a surprise for undergraduates in two ways. Who are these women, and how do we know about them?
So, I mean, I think we've had very similar kinds of experiences with that regard, right? I mean, there's always the question of, do you teach women's and gender history as its own sort of a, subfield, right? Something that requires that sort of its own, a space, versus the notion of sort of mainstreaming it, right? And making gender and women really critical lenses through which to examine mainstream, history. So likewise, teaching classes on, war or empire in ways that are not necessarily intuitive to the students or goes against their expectations. I've had to do a lot of massaging at the very beginning of courses to be clear and upfront about the reason why I teach the course the way I do and what the benefits that I'm promising are. And we will see at the end of the course, if the students are compelled, right, by what we do. But I think it's a tricky question because I do want to continue to highlight that as sort of mainstream as women and gender have become in some ways. I mean, these are still areas under like assault, right, in many ways. And the continued sort of devaluation of this form of knowledge and teaching and scholarship is something we have to, very actively, I think, kind of contest, right? So determining to what extent, the sort of space or place of women and gender, today has become normalized or legitimized is really a kind of lip service as opposed to really like a reckoning with, the ways in which it has been devalued in the past, right, and marginalized. It continues to be a question I think about.
Yeah, we just met nothing but resistance in the 70s and 80s in beginning to do this. There were, in my graduate Ph.D. program, there were no women's historians, no historians of gender. There was a woman faculty member who did one brilliant piece that dealt with female apprentices in the Ottoman Empire, but she was not very sympathetic to women's history. But what it meant is that as graduate students, it was outsourced to us, and we got to bring in mentors from all over the US and the world who were beginning to create that field in the 70s and who inspired us. One of them was our own Board of Governors, Professor Emerita Deborah Gray White, who I remember came and gave a talk to us graduate students that blew us away and was fantastic. So lots of resistance, and in my first job, there was no women's studies or program at all, and a bunch of us kind of began to smuggle it in by getting a women's history. I got the first women's history course on the books. In a way, I guess there might have been a privilege of being a man, that somehow it was perceived to be slightly less threatening that a male scholar was doing it. But there was a tremendous amount of resistance for the first 20 years. And then I think there was a moment where the sheer brilliance of the work produced by women's historians as they embraced gender was so undeniable. And these people became such important leaders of each of our fields that there was a tipping point. And there were different forms, like different forms of resistance of the kind that Rachel and Chie, you've just talked about, which is different than the outright mockery and you can't do it, but it's still powerful and the work remains unfinished.
I agree with everything that Seth said, and I appreciate the way you break it down in years and decades. I would say that this issue, there's the brilliant women scholars and historians of gender have indeed convinced the profession of the necessity of women's history. But I would also argue that we're still debating who can write it, how they can write it. So for instance, Jim Sweet, who was the president of the American Historical Association, said last summer that historians are too involved in identity politics and they talk too much in a presentist lens, meaning that historians of women and gender, historians of race, historians of colonialism and gender and oppression, if you are a woman who is doing it, you have a political perspective that is not objective, and objectivity being at the center of the historical profession. So it is contested whether or not women who are practicing women's history are being objective. Whereas when men, and that's what allowed Seth, as he just said, he seemed like nonpartisan. But whereas when men write histories of men, no one questions whether or not they're being objective. So I think there's still this way in which there's a question mark hanging over women and gender, historians of African American history, historians of empire and Asia and gender. There was this great moment and flowering, but it doesn't mean that there's not still room towards legitimization.
Mm-hmm. Definitely, yeah. I wanted to also talk about the flip side of the resistance to women's history and talk about any notable achievements in the field that may have also helped contribute to its academic legitimacy.
Where do we start?
Yeah.
I think we could start with Rutgers itself. Rutgers really has an extraordinary place in producing and making the world know how amazing different versions of women's history can be. And so many of the path-breaking scholars in African American history, in European and US history, in global history, were faculty here at Rutgers. So I think we should have a moment of at least, if not patting ourselves in the back, realizing what incredible legacy we are the inheritors of.
I guess I'd also like to say that in my field, I study Philippine history, a lot of the people that I've read and engaged with as path-breaking scholars happen to also do women and gender history. So I've been really lucky in that the field that I've come into is one that has already recognized the value of that perspective. So I think that's one thing to be proud about. Yeah.
I think when Natalie Zeman Davis became president of the American Historical Association in 1987 was a pretty big moment. She had pioneered early modern French and European history, but with a particular commitment to women on top and to bringing anthropology and feminist theory into the conversation. And that was certainly a moment where I think many people felt, wow, here is this path-breaking, generous leader who ultimately expanded her remit into transnational histories, into histories of race, histories of religion. She welcomed so many people into women's history and had a certain magical touch that made it seem as if the tent could be ever bigger, that there was never a need to have a litmus test of whether you were really a women's historian or not.
Definitely, yeah, thank you. So we've talked a little bit about, and you were just talking about the ways in the different fields of women's history as a subdiscipline itself. And all of you guys are researching and working in different fields of women's history as well. So I wanted to ask, how can we, and important is it that we, foster more inclusive, diversive, and intersectional perspectives on things like race and ethnicity and sexuality in women's history?
Well, I think our program has done a tremendous, job. I would actually say that, I was hired around the same time as Rachel, actually, by my department, that was running just these very open searches in women's and gender history. And never, I applied, so perhaps I did imagine, but in a sense, I never would have imagined that in an open search on women's and gender history that, the top program in women's and gender history would hire someone who works on Southeast Asia, of all places, right? Because even, Southeast Asia is this perceived to be this tiny little corner of the world, right? Sandwiched between China and India, and really, even when there are searches on Asian, history, there are very few scholars who work on Southeast Asia who would rise to the top, simply because you don't work on the major civilizational sort of centers, of the world. And you know this very well.
So well.
Right? And so I think it's a testament to the vision of, I think, the program, at Rutgers University, that says that women's and gender history, to thrive, right, must necessarily really sort of take on that question of being global, right, and transregional and transnational, right, and that when we ask the question of women and gender from these really multiple and, disparate locations, both temporally and geographically, that's when we get to really kind of complicate, right, and enrich what we do with women and gender as analytic, as ways of historicizing, right? So I think that's certainly, it's not even so much a question of diversity and inclusion, but that it necessarily, in order to breathe new life into women's and gender history and to the question of women and gender and sexuality, right? No one can sit comfortably in one little corner, of the globe, right? And think about its history sort of separate from what's happening elsewhere.
Thank you. So you were talking a bit about the Rutgers, Rutgers in general and the Rutgers grad school program. So Rutgers University does have one of the best women's history grad school programs in the country, if not the best. And I wanted to ask,
best.
Yes. And I wanted to ask what you think it is about Rutgers specifically that has allowed it to have such success in women's history.
Perhaps.
Yeah, I would
My
defer
senior
to
colleagues.
he's been in the department.
I think Douglas College helped a lot, having always Rutgers emerged as an amalgam of these different colleges, but the presence of Douglas as a center that valued women and explored and nurtured their leadership and their power, I think, has been important, even if Douglas's history, like the history of every college and university in America, has been marked by various forms of exclusion, by certain versions of narrow-mindedness and prejudice and racism that can be named. Nonetheless, I think having Douglas be part of this amalgam that emerged as Rutgers after World War II was really, really helpful. I think another point is that the Rutgers History Department, as it united the different departments from which it was made, Rutgers College, Livingston, Douglas, all these departments came together. It had a hunger and an innovative, unself-satisfied quality to it, in which its members really sought out talent, and talent found it, regardless of who they were. And so I think that that's at least part of it. And part of it is the good fortune of having made some amazing hires of people who were path-breaking scholars and who remain committed to nurturing the field at Rutgers.
Yeah, I would just add to that they're non-credentialed and credentialed historians. So in the early phases, it was the women's colleges who really sought out, who created who gave a space for women's history in ways that were organic to those schools. But I would also say that And also those schools tended to legitimize uncredentialed historians, journalists, people who were not on the tenure track, that kind of thing. But Rutgers, in that process, I consider it to be a bit of a rock in the winds of change, because feminism in particular tends to have moments where it comes in and out of fashion in a way that tends to be spectacular on both sides. And Rutgers has a sense of continuity about it and respects its own contribution to that continuity in a way that has a lasting power. And so I'm always grateful for the sense of solidity that this university, Douglas also, the Women and Gender Studies, it's so needed. You know, I mean, we have to have it.
I think, the very fact of the program you're in, the IWL, and, really supporting what both Seth and Rachel have said too, it has not thrived on its own, right? Its flourishing has had to do with the fact that there is a community, and right, we stand strong despite our differences, and despite whatever differences that might be, disciplinary and otherwise, right? As a collective, that this is an institution or university that has so many resources for scholars of women, gender, sexuality, not just history, either. And those, and people draw inspiration from being in these multiple spaces. The Institute for Research on Women, for instance, right? It's an interdisciplinary space, but, the Institute for Women's Leadership, right? That I think cultivates a kind of rich variety, right? And a variety of spaces in which you find your sort of special research and teaching, right? And corner of women's and gender history, and come to support one another if one, unit is in trouble, let's say, or in crisis, right? Institution and departments may not have life of its own, but we as scholars, teachers, we do, and we connect with one another, we talk with one another, right? And I think we have a network and we have a community. I think that has been also helpful, and I think the same is true for graduate students and students. They need that very much, I think.
Yeah, I'd say the same, that the community as a graduate student and as somebody that is also part of another institution, that the community at Rutgers is very unique. I think there's just a critical mass of people in all sorts of different fields and working in different capacities towards women and gender studies as a discipline and in practice, I think has been tremendous. Yeah.
One way to connect a couple of your questions together is your question about intersectionality and then your question about us at Rutgers, is that support can also come in the form of really challenging and difficult criticism. And sometimes those criticisms can push you back and make you aware of your own blind spots. But being in conversation with diverse scholars who bring different knowledges and different ethical commitments to their work can sharpen your own and can push you to embrace that which you have not seen and begin to explore it and productively integrate it into your own work. So one of our strengths, I think, is also in a support that is critique.
Right.
Because critique, painful as it can sometimes be, because we all want affirmation, is an essential part of growing.
Yeah, definitely. While we're on the topic of institutions and universities, things like that, I wanted to ask you, what are so not all universities have what Rutgers has. Many universities don't have women's history programs and might not even have women's history courses that they teach. So what steps can universities take to develop undergraduate history programs? And kind of more essentially, how significant is the development of women's history as an academic unit for its growth and reception? I stumped you.
Yeah. And one thing, we're sending our graduate students, our undergraduates, out into the field. And one of my former students, an undergrad, now teaches at Wilson College, a tiny college in rural Pennsylvania. And they had an archive. They used to be an all-women's school. She's in the archive. She's finding who the former students were. And she's teaching women and gender, and it hadn't been taught at that school. That school is mostly an engineering school. So this is very slow, arduous, at times tedious work because you have to, these things take a very long time. And if you're just counting your students who you've sent out, that's going to take 20 years. So it's hard to quantify how to build. And institutional building takes a kind of day in, day out commitment that isn't all that glamorous. So it's a tough question in that way.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
No, and I, in general, I do not believe that top-down sort of institutional measures stick. I think to the extent that institutions can actually support organic, faculty-led, student-led, ground-up, initiatives. And I mean, if institutions actually listened and supported those things more, I think we'd be in a very different place. But that's not always the case, right? And so, my one answer is I'm hesitant to propose what institutions should do, so to speak, besides saying, listen to your students, listen to your faculty, and devote your resources maybe in that direction. And it takes time, right? I think most initiatives that are meant to sort of transform things overnight don't really work. So, but I mean, that would be one idea.
Yeah, I think maybe there's a role that public history initiatives can play in supporting the generation and growth of grassroots movements and demands for women in gender history. So I found that there are lots of people that I've engaged with in different community organizations that would like to know more. And I think that having that force inside and outside of university spaces could be useful. So finding ways to bring women and gender history to the public could also support eventual institutional change.
What do you think, Seth?
There's a supply and a demand in a sense. And so I think what you all are saying makes such great sense. The idea of drawing on public history, of course, women were there and engaging in community, students making demands, students going in to say to their chairs of department and their deans, there are women students, there are lots and lots of women undergraduates and non-male undergraduates across the United States who can begin to say, we want to know about our history and we want to have a place where this can be told and where we can learn and where we can bring our perspectives. And then, of course, there are the pipelines of scholars who are there to teach it. But we can also learn new fields as well. So even at institutions that aren't going to commit to hiring in women's history, they can commit resources to have such courses taught.
I just want to pick up on this issue of public history, the commitment to women's history and to the ways in which other marginalized groups have been studied and continue to challenge us as historians. That other ripple effects of taking women's history seriously are oral history archives that Rutgers also has, and oral history became a subset of women's history initially and social history. So I think that commitment brings in a larger group of people, a humbler group of people who don't necessarily see themselves as a historical subject. And the other thing that Rutgers does is run seminars for high school teachers in New Jersey. So we try to take our research and make it broadly understood. And other places where I've taught, that hasn't been a value. So I think the value, the value of public history, the practice of bringing in high school teachers, that these are all impulses that are connected to what was considered a new field and continues to feel like a novel field.
I wanted to potentially jump back to something we were talking about earlier, which is the debate between somewhat contentious debate between whether women's history should be called women's history or gender history, and whether you think such a distinction is necessary.
Well, I mean, I run an institute called Institute for Research on Women, and we have these debates a lot. The Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies didn't always have sexuality, attached to it, right? And this is a pattern that's unfolded all across the United States. Formally, units that were formerly associated with women's studies, women's history, have added gender or have had gender and sexuality. We also debate whether we should have feminist, right? Included in titles. What's in a name, right? I think looking at it now, I think we can sometimes overemphasize. I'm really interested, to hear what everyone thinks about this. But I think people have approached this question with a great deal of nuance, actually, and much more so than some scholarship might suggest, right? And have thought long and hard about how capacious and how inclusive can women be, right? Can it shed its history of being like white, sort of particular class, sort of a subject, right? And feminist too. I mean, can it really accommodate for the differences and tensions, right, within that have emerged out of transnational and sort of, cross-border forms of feminisms, right? And I don't know that there's an easy answer to that, but I think it is important that it raises these questions and scholars continue to struggle with it. And renaming units hasn't actually entirely resolved, right, those questions. And I think in a sense, it might give the false sense that it's easily resolvable or it's settled, right, when it isn't actually, right? I think it's the continued labor and work that we put in to really sitting with very real differences that we have in our understandings and visions of what women's and gender and feminist, say, right, studies and histories are about, right? That is like really part of the intellectual work that we do. So.
This debate goes back, this is 30 years old at least, and women and gender studies, gender, sexuality, and some of the women who had been on the barricades in the 1970s were distraught when programs took out women entirely. Yes. And they really said, if that's taken out, we won't get it back in. And it's a name, what we name defines us. And so how do we keep women in it while still questioning what women, what are the differences? How is the category of woman contested? So programs are trying to do both at once, and it's quite difficult and challenging, but it's also generative, and in that scholars coming from different places, as Seth was saying earlier, both challenge one another and enrich one another. And we ask each other questions. But yeah, keeping our eye on the word woman is an important challenge that we all should continue to revisit.
And it feels like the stakes are different now, right? With women being sort of called out as a special interest, group, and sort of legislative, legal transformations, right? I mean, and Rutgers is right smack in the middle of it with an entire college named, right, for women, right? When the majority of students at Rutgers are now women, right? And questions about, like, what does it mean to continue to devote this space, right, and special status to women when they're no longer a minority, right? So, I mean, I think the stakes are really, really high now, especially. And I think, actually, it really makes us revisit that question of the importance of holding on to women, right, even as we embrace gender and sexuality.
Okay, as we're getting close to wrapping up, I wanted to ask all of you guys, what would you say to someone who is not necessarily interested in women's history to kind of get them to understand what it is or get them interested? Essentially, what would you say to encourage someone to study or consider studying women's history?
I feel like I've talked a lot.
You'll be surprised. Students are, and this is why I started with recovery as an ongoing necessary component of women's history. It seems very basic, But again, for instance, New York State came up with a pedagogy that had to include a certain number of historical names in order to graduate. You should know these names. Out of 50, there were 2 women. So, and this was 2 years ago that they came up with this new format for teaching history. So, but the surprise also comes with questions that haven't been asked. It can deepen your perspective on your other fields. How do we quantify labor? What is labor and what is emotion? What is labor and what is love? And how can we quantify the contributions and activities of groups that weren't quantified initially? And that takes enormous amounts of effort and imagination. And that's what pushes students to think beyond what seems like a very solid past.
I'm interested to know your perspective specifically because you're studying women's history right now, working to get your Ph.D. Like, what drew you to women's history?
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I think that what drew me to women's history was honestly that my family tradition is a very feminist and activist sort of women. And so that was maybe a way of thinking that I was around, and that led my own thinking when I entered graduate school. But I honestly like the challenge of it. I think that the recovery of women in the archives is an interesting challenge. I think that gender is a very pervasive force. And I work in a part of the world where maybe race isn't as salient as other categories. And so gender remains very distinct, gender, class, and to a lesser extent, like different ethnic identities. But so for me, it's a really interesting sort of like intellectual challenge. But I also feel it has a lot of meaning today, and there's a lot of real impact that can be made with understanding how these categories have functioned in the past and how they've changed and how we've gotten to the point that we have today. So that's what drew me. When I talk to other people about it, I do a lot of public history programs, and it's honestly just about trying to show people that that gender is everywhere. It really is something that structures the way that we interact in everyday life. There is this sort of like power behind it, and trying to help people see that often draws people more into the conversation than just talking about a woman in particular. Yeah.
I just love the way you put that, because so I guess maybe the clincher to convince a person would be to build on what you just said, to let that person know that because gender is everywhere, shaping, forming, informing, making, unmaking the world, and even that individual person's life, that the opportunity to study something we're calling women's history will allow them to both understand who they are in a new way, the personal as political, but also see their world afresh, because so much, as you said, is invisible. And making it visible, or you said much earlier, denaturalizing the things that we take as given. And as Rachel said to us just minutes ago, entering into that conversation in which all of the terms are up for grabs, and we think about how their meanings have changed and their uses and possibilities have changed. So yeah, that would be part of my argument.
Thank you. Did you have anything to add?
Oh, no, I think my co-panelists have done such a good job. I mean, me too, just like, Cai. I mean, I came to it because I think it's not the only field within history, but certainly it's one of the fields in which I think I learned to read and to see power, or to start really be able to analyze it, right, clearly. I learned to see power from when I was young, but I didn't know like how to put words, onto what I was experiencing, what I was seeing, and women's and gender history really helped me to do that. So I think in helping, it really helps us understand difference and power, I think, in such a unique way.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I think all of your insights were really incredible, and I think will be helpful to understanding the broader conversation about women's history in general. And so thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for organizing us.
So happy to be in conversation.
It's always nice to reflect on women's history.
What an honor. Thank you for asking.
Yes.